Ever feel like you're juggling chainsaws? Like you're totally swamped with deadlines, long-term goals, and then bam, unexpected events pop up.
And everything's happening at 1,000,000 miles an hour.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's what we're talking about today, this idea of temporal complexity.
Oh, okay.
Which is basically a fancy way of saying it feels like time is out of control.
And we are definitely not the only ones feeling it.
Not at all. In fact, even Germany's Vice Chancellor Robert Habeck said that this sense of like everything happening at once is one of the biggest challenges we face today.
Wow, if it's got world leaders stressing,
yeah,
it must be serious.
It's a big deal. And that's exactly what this paper you sent, Eigenzeit, a new lens on temporal complexity, is trying to unpack.
Okay, so Eigenzeit, it sounds a little intimidating. I'm not going to lie.
It's a mouthful for sure.
Yeah.
But it basically translates to own time, which is kind of perfect because the paper argues that just like we have our own internal rhythms, organizations develop their own kind of internal clocks to cope with all the external crazy.
So it's like, even though the world is total chaos, organizations are trying to find their own beat, their own rhythm to deal with it.
Exactly. It's like saying, okay, the world might be nuts, but we're going to try to find our own center.
I like it. I can get behind that.
And a big part of that is recognizing that different organizations and even different teams within those organizations, they operate on totally different timescales.
Okay, so we've got this Eigenzeit thing going on, organizations creating their own internal groove.
Yeah.
But how do they actually pull that off?
So the paper talks about these two main mechanisms, temporal uncoupling and temporal differentiation. And uncoupling is like when you hit pause before reacting to something urgent, you know.
Instead of just immediately firing off a response to that email that says urgent.
Right.
In all caps.
Right. It's about taking a breath, creating some space between you and that external pressure so you can be more strategic and less reactive.
Which reminds me of that newsroom example from the paper. Even with the news cycle going 24/7, they don't just throw every single story on air. They filter and decide what's actually important based on their own rhythm.
Perfect example of uncoupling in action. They're not letting the chaos dictate their every move.
I love it. Okay, so what about temporal differentiation? What's that all about?
So that's the idea that not everything needs to run on the same clock.
Okay, so like a sales team that's always chasing the next deal, they're going to have a different rhythm than, say, the research and development folks who need time to think and experiment.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that different parts of the organization have their own tempos, their own ways of getting things done.
This is starting to feel less like a theoretical physics lecture and more like something you could actually use, which I am here for. So we've got this internal clock, the Eigenzeit, and organizations use tools like uncoupling and differentiation to make it work. But what happens when those internal clocks, those different Eigenzeits, they clash?
That's where things get even more interesting because it turns out there are different modes of Eigenzeit and they're not all created equal.
Modes, you say?
Yeah.
All right, lay it on me.
Okay, so the paper breaks it down into 4 different modes. 2 are kind of basic ones that a lot of organizations fall into. And then there are 2 more, you could say advanced ones. We can start with the first 2, entrainment and ambitemporality.
Okay, those are definitely words.
Yeah, they're a mouthful.
My brain could use a dictionary right about now.
So think of entrainment, like this, you're marching to the beat of someone else's drum. Picture that startup company that's obsessed with being first to market. Everything they do, every decision they make revolves around that one goal.
Oh, I've been there. It's exhausting.
It is. And while that kind of laser focus can be great in the short term, it can also make you miss other important stuff like sustainability or even just employee well-being.
So they might win the race, but they'll be totally burned out.
Exactly. Now, ambitemporality, that's a different beast. It's less about following one rhythm and more about trying to dance the tango with 2 left feet.
Ouch. That sounds messy.
It can be. Think of a company trying to balance rapid innovation with long-term sustainability. Those 2 things don't always go hand in hand, right?
Right. It's like they're being pulled in 2 opposite directions.
Exactly. That tension, that's ambitemporality in a nutshell.
Okay, I'm starting to see why the authors call these the basic modes. It seems like most organizations are either sprinting towards burnout or stuck in this awkward tango.
And that's where the other 2 modes come in agile mode and pluritemporal mode. These are like the pros, the ones who have figured out how to not just cope with multiple rhythms, but actually make them work for them.
Okay, now I'm really interested. Let's talk about agile mode first.
Agile. It's a buzzword for a reason. Think of a company like Spotify. They've got a product roadmap and a long-term vision, but they're also constantly adapting based on user feedback, market trends, even their own experiments.
So it's less about sticking to a rigid plan and more about having a core rhythm that can bend and change.
Exactly. Like jazz musicians, they have a deep understanding of the music, but they're also not afraid to improvise, to change the tempo, to bring in new elements.
That is way more my speed than trying to conduct an orchestra where everyone's playing a different tune at the same time.
And speaking of different tunes, that brings us to pluritemporal mode. This one's the most complex and probably the most fascinating of the four.
All right, hit me. What does a pluritemporal organization actually look like?
Imagine you've got a huge collaboration, like trying to tackle climate change. You've got governments with their election cycles, scientists with their research timelines, businesses worried about quarterly profits, activists demanding immediate action.
It's like herding cats, except the cats are all moving at the speed of light.
It's definitely chaotic, but that's the challenge and the potential of pluritemporal mode. It's about juggling multiple timelines, not just two, like in ambitemporality, but many different ones. And somehow you have to keep it all moving towards a shared goal.
Okay, my brain is officially tied in knots just thinking about that. How do they even begin to do that?
It's not so much about having a secret formula. It's more about a fundamental shift in thinking. Pluritemporal organizations get that different rhythms aren't a bug, they're a feature. They're not trying to impose one single tempo. They're trying to orchestrate the whole symphony.
So instead of forcing everyone to march to the beat of their drum, they're learning to dance with the rhythms that are already there.
Exactly. And that takes a high degree of temporal differentiation. They have to be able to switch between different internal clocks depending on who they're dealing with and what they're trying to accomplish. And it takes a deep understanding of how different timelines are connected. How a decision made today might have ripple effects months or even years down the line.
This is blowing my mind. So we've got these four modes, 2 basic and 2 advanced. But for the people listening out there, how do we figure out where we fit into all of this? So we've spent all this time talking about these 4 modes of Eigenzeit entrainment, ambitemporality, agile, pluritemporal, from basic to like temporal ninjas. But how do we actually figure out where we fit in all of this?
Well, the good news is this paper doesn't just throw a bunch of jargon at us and call it a day. They actually give us some tools to figure out our own organization's deal.
Okay, so it's like a temporal toolkit. Sign me up.
Right. So the first thing is to figure out what your organization's dominant Eigenzeit mode actually is. Like, what really drives the work you do? Are you constantly chasing deadlines? Or is there a clear internal rhythm? Are you trying to be everything to everyone? Or do you have different approaches for different projects and different people?
So it's like taking inventory of our relationship with time, figuring out what's working, what's clashing, and what might be missing altogether.
Exactly. And then here's the important part. Is this mode actually working for you? Are you achieving your goals, or are you constantly feeling behind the curve?
Because no one wants to be that organization that's still trying to change the tire while the competition is crossing the finish line.
Exactly. And the good news is we're not stuck with the mode we're in. The paper talks about organizations developing temporal autonomy.
Ooh, temporal autonomy. It sounds so powerful, like I'm finally taking control of my calendar notifications.
It's definitely more than just silencing notifications, though. That's a good start. It's really about having the skills and strategies to choose your tempo, like when to speed up, when to slow down, when to sync up with external forces, when to march to the beat of your own drum.
Okay, so less reacting, more conducting our own temporal orchestra. I like it.
Yeah.
But how do we actually get there?
Well, it's a journey, not a quick fix. It starts with being aware of those existing rhythms, then trying out new approaches, maybe even challenging some of those deeply ingrained ideas about how work should be done.
So less rulebook, more jazz improvisation.
Exactly. But before you go full-on free jazz on your team, remember that question the authors asked? Can organizations become too focused on their internal rhythms and miss important signals from the outside world?
Oh, that's a good point. It's like they're so busy jamming in their soundproof studio, they don't even notice the earthquake happening outside.
Exactly. Temporal autonomy is great, but it's not about living in a bubble. It's about finding that sweet spot between internal rhythm and being able to respond to the world around you.
A delicate dance between control and adaptation.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on. Understanding our relationship with time isn't just about getting things done. It's about survival, adaptation, and yeah, even a little improvisation. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Eigenzeit. Until next time, remember, you have the power to create your own rhythm.